All right, guys, here's our last recorded lecture for the semester. Chapter 12, how do we respond to serial killers? So apprehending serial killers is obviously very difficult. Um, they're highly mobile, they cross jurisdictions, yet remain in a pretty small geographic area. They tend to prefer strangers as victims. They're careful to minimize the evidence that is left behind. And sometimes months can pass before law enforcement even realizes that there is a trend of missing people. Finally, interagency cooperation can be pretty challenging. Now, when we do know there is a serial killer operating, public anxiety obviously wants us to find a solution quickly. But these investigations require a lot of coordination and a lot of resources. So they often are going to involve more than one law enforcement agency, and that can be difficult. They also require a lot of money and other resources. So in the Green River Killer case, there were 20,000 names that police were looking at, and it cost the taxpayers $20 million. The Unabomber case spanned 18 years, had 3 task forces, and $75 million. Now, of course, none of that is reason to not conduct an investigation, but it is important to realize just how many resources go into this. So Glover and Witham point out 4 issues in managing major cases like this. One is to think about the media impact, right? We know that anything that appears to be extraordinary, the media wants to jump on, right? So long-term media coverage creates a lot of pressure on police. This 24-hour news cycle and this desire to kind of be right there with new information puts a lot of pressure on the police. Police, however, have to establish good working relationships with the media. Then you have to think about how you're going to manage all your department resources. Who takes charge of the investigation? Who makes sure everything flows correctly? Then we also have multi-agency jurisdiction. Okay, so unless you've got a serial killer only killing in one particular city or town, right, which we don't see, we're going to have to coordinate investigations across jurisdictions. Also, these are very complex cases. Lots of victims, different locations, different modes of death can create problems in terms of sorting out all of the data, all the information you have. Now, there's a couple standards that deal with what kind of forensic evidence is allowed in court. So, in 1923 in Fry versus US, Supreme Court set the standard for scientific evidence. Okay, evidence that's used in court that's science-based has to have general acceptance within the field. Okay, so in order for new information to be examined by the court, has to be examined has to be examined by the court before it's presented to the jury. Now, in 1993, there's another court case, Dober v. Merrill Dow. Okay, and this gave courts more discretion, where the judge could basically determine whether or not the science was appropriate to be admitted. But this was based on statutory grounds and wasn't constitutional grounds. So courts are more likely to follow the Fry standard. So let's think about profiling, right? We hear this a lot, in particular with serial killers, and it's an investigative tool, okay? And there's a lot of things we want to keep in mind with profiling. Profiling sounds exciting. If you've watched Criminal Minds, it looks exciting, but just like many other TV shows that are based on the criminal justice system, what you see happen in Criminal Minds is not remotely accurate. So, profiling is an investigative tool, okay? It can give us direction when an investigation is stalled. It can help us give some maybe psychological insights when we're conducting interviews. They can offer advice for like, how do you present this to the jury? But it's still more art than science. Amongst folks who consider themselves informed and knowledgeable about profiling, oh no, a typo. Less than 25% believe it is scientifically reliable or valid in general. Programs that are developed based on profiling take years of testing and refining before they can actually be evaluated. Oh God, another typo. So a great way to end the semester, guys. In order for profiling, though, to really fulfill the potential it has, police need to be willing to work with academics and medical professionals. And a lot of times they do not. Finally, developing these rigorous profiles or reliable profiles is much more rigorous than we tend to think. So McCrae has laid out for us crime phases of a murderer's behavior. First, there's the antecedent behavior. What's happening before the crime? Is the killer involved in fantasy? Are they planning to kill? Are they involved in both? Then we have the method and the manner. What type of victim or victims did the murderer choose? What method was used to kill? Then we have body disposal. Did the murder and the body disposal occur in the same location, in different locations? Post-defense behavior. Is the killer using the media to insert themselves in the investigation? Did they make contact with law enforcement? What's the offender doing afterwards? So in terms of types of profiling, your book's going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 types of profiling. Okay. So the first one is offender profiling. This is where law enforcement agencies collect data. This could be from case studies, anecdotal evidence, and then they use that for general descriptions of the types of people most likely to commit certain types of crime. But you want to remember that we are terrible at predicting who is going to offend and how they're going to offend. Now, Cantor used some computers to develop the Radix model, and using computers was able to map criminal behavior. They were able to examine it and measure it at a very general level, and then move out to more specific levels of offending, specific types of offending. Now, this other model, which is from Australia, I believe, is multidimensional scaling. And this produced a 5-cluster model of sexual murder behavior. So what they did is they start with a central cluster that represents behavior that's common of all sexual murders. And then as they move out, we're able to see patterns that revealed four other types: rape, fury, predator, and perversion, each which had their own distinct offense styles. Now we can also profile the victim, right? And this is a lot of what victimology is. So this is where we're going to look at the personality and behavior characteristics of crime victims who tend to fall prey to certain types of offenders. Now keep in mind, that's not saying that those victims are responsible for their own victimization. But we can get some information through interviews with the witnesses, with victims, family and friends, information we get from autopsies. And this might help us kind of see, what do these victims have in common? Now, some researchers did a study where they looked at 30 years of juvenile and adult sexual homicide offenders. And they pulled this from the Supplemental Homicide Report from 1976 to 2005. It's part of the UCR program. For all homicides, there's some additional information that's provided, and it's put in a different report. And they found some race and age-based differences. So Black offenders were overrepresented in the study. Whites were most likely to kill intraracially across all 4 age groups. Blacks, however, killed both intraracially and interracially. For Blacks, interracial killing increased with the age of the victim. So how does this information help us? The better we can understand what's happening with crime, the better we can help with investigations, and it's really helpful for crime prevention. If we know what sort of things put people at risk, then perhaps we can do things to address those risk factors. Now, a couple other researchers looked at lethal outcomes and victimizations. And you might have noticed that this researcher, Beauregard, has been throughout our book. He does a lot of research on sex offenders. He's got this amazing data set in Canada of sex offenders. And he's also looked at a lot of like sexual homicide. And so he and his co-author here looked at violent sexual assaults where victims were killed. And they divided killing events into three domains. What were the victim characteristics? What are the crime characteristics? And what are the situational characteristics? And they found that specific characteristics of the actual crime and specific victim characteristics are strongly associated with fatal outcomes. So, for instance, Beauregard did a study with a professor of mine, Joan Reed. She does a lot more work on human trafficking. But she and he did this study where they looked at different ways that sex offenders had attacked somebody. And they found that every time they went after you, like with a chain, with anything to like go around your neck, you should always fight back. Because in all of those cases, people generally ended up dead. That's your cheerful thought for the day. Okay, now our next type of profiling is equivocal death analysis, which is basically a psychological autopsy. So investigators are going to use non-scientific information to try to explain motivations of people who committed suicide or difficult to explain deaths. So Dr. Schneidman describes a psychological autopsy as a reconstruction of the motivations, philosophy, psychodynamics, and existential crises of the decedent. Now, Nolan Friedman looked at 18 homicides, suicides in Dallas to try to better understand motives and context of these deaths. So they interview police, they look at coroner reports, interview family members, and they found that 2/3 of offenders were what they called consortial possessive. These are men suffering from depression, they're abusing drugs or alcohol, and going through marital separations. Now, DNA profiling is exactly what it sounds like, right? We can gather DNA from the crime scene, from victims, from offenders, and we can use that to match it to suspects when we have them, or we can run it through CODIS, which is the Combined DNA Index System, to see if any known offenders match this DNA profile. Now, Beauregard does another study where they look at forensic awareness. How forensically aware are offenders? And they looked at sexual assault. They looked at rape in Canada. As I mentioned, he has this data set of data he's collected on Canadian sex offenders. They found a couple things. Offenders who are under the influence, not as forensically aware. That kind of makes sense, right? We're generally not great at attention to detail if we're under the influence. Those who had target preferences took more forensic precautions. Those who entered a victim's residence were more likely to exhibit forensic awareness as well. But overall, offenders are kind of inconsistent in their forensic awareness. They direct most of their efforts towards protecting their identity, but sometimes forget and leave DNA at the crime scene. We can also do a profile of the crime scene, and this is also referred to as criminal investigation. And this is what most people think of when they think of profiling. This is what the behavioral science unit in the FBI did. So they look at crime scene descriptions, photographs, offender behavior before and after, traffic patterns, physical evidence, victim information. They don't place as much credence on psychological data. Now, in 1988, they published this study. They looked at 36 serial offenders, and you guys are probably familiar with this organized, disorganized dichotomy, right? Organized offenders are methodical, premeditated, resourceful. Disorganized offenders, right, are random and opportunistic. And they're really kind of presented as like an either or, when really they're more of a spectrum. But more important than that, this isn't reliable and it isn't actually useful. So say you are on a task force, you're looking at a series of murders. This doesn't necessarily help you in terms of your investigation and figuring out who the offender is. Psychological profiling is where profilers look at the personality characteristics of a certain type of offender and compare it to the suspect. So they're using interviews and testing to try to establish a base of information. Now, these experts are often asked to predict future behavior. Okay. As I said, we're not good at this. we're terrible at it. You got a better chance at just kind of like flipping a coin and guessing. Now, geographic profiling is also called spatial mapping. This is where we're going to look at the geography and the environment to connect crime scenes to offender habitats and hunting grounds. This is where you might look at places on a map, and this might help you figure out, where does this offender tend to strike? Where does he tend to commit his crimes? And that might help you figure out where he lives. This is empirically based, okay? This is based in science. It does help police figure out where they should start canvassing, knocking on doors, setting up stakeouts. Now, in terms of this, I think I went the wrong way. Sorry, guys. Now, Rossimo talks about 4 offender styles in victim hunting. Hunters who identify specific victims in their home areas. Poachers who prefer to travel away from home to hunt for victims. Trollers who are opportunistic. They're going about their regular activities and opportunity strikes. And trappers who basically lay a trap for victims. So guess what? Here's my boy Beauregard again. Beauregard and co-authors examined rational choice in the hunting process of 69 convicted serial sex offenders. You might have noticed there's quite a few times in our textbook, right, where they talk about behavior of sex offenders. And that's because we know that a lot of serial killers have sex offender behavior. So they looked at accounts from the offenders, and they were able to look at, see that there were certain phases. So what's the offender and the victim's routine activities? How's the victim selected? Then they're transported to the crime site. What's your hunting ground? Your attack location? How do you approach? How do you actually carry out your crime? Where do you carry out your crime? And where do you release your victim? Now, researchers are starting to focus more on environmental criminology. How can we understand the environment that the offender is operating in? So crimes are more likely to occur closer to an offender's home, and the farther away he or she travels from home base, the fewer crimes they're likely to commit. Right? We tend to commit crimes in our home base because we know that area better. We know many escape routes. It's just an area we know better. Now, serial predators prefer to operate in comfort zones. And this kind of relates back to that geographic profiling, right? Now, serial predators often create a buffer zone between their crimes and where they live. But profiling this, mapping this out, can help you figure out where their residence might be. Now, our last profiling type is paraphilia profiling. So this is identifying various forms of paraphilia that the sex offender or sexual predator is engaging in. Sex crime scenes are often replete with evidence of this behavior. Now, Beauregard and some other friends found that successful sex offenders are offenders who specialize in sex crimes. Okay, so most offenders do not specialize in a particular type of crime. Most of them engage in a wide variety of offending. But the sex offenders that are successful, right, so they're able to do it over and over again, tend to specialize. They tend to come in 2 types: long-term abusers of specific victims and younger offenders who have multiple victims. Either way, once these offenders are in the criminal justice system, we're not doing a lot to prevent them from reoffending. Now, Beauregard and some friends also looked at offenders who killed children, and they looked at developmental, pre-crime, and post-crime factors. And offenders who killed children were more likely to have used pornography prior to the killing and had contact with the victim prior to the crime. They're also more likely to be premeditated, to strangle their victims, and to hide or dispose of the corpse than those who kill women. They're also more likely to have been victims themselves of child sexual abuse and engage in more deviant sexual fantasies. Now, I just want to remind everybody, right? Sometimes we see with certain types of offenders, many of them have been victims of, child sexual abuse or domestic violence. That doesn't mean, though, that having been a victim of either of those 2 types of offenses, that you are likely to go on to be an offender, right? Kind of works in the opposite direction. Most sex offenders have been sexually abused, but most people who have been sexually abused are not sex offenders. Just want to make sure that distinction is clear. So Nolan Hazelwood is a guy that was a profiler, described 2 cases where sadistic paraphilic predators assumed identities of their victims during the course of torture murders in order to enhance their own gratification, right? So remember, thinking back to some of the stuff we talked about in these earlier chapters, right? A lot of times these serial killers have some really dark, deviant paraphilias. Now, Costin looks at 38 convicted serial sex murderers, and they ask them what are their reasons. Now, the majority of subjects excuse their behavior, right? Saying, oh, they're not responsible for their crimes. They were abused as a kid. It's not my fault, right? And a lot of them also said no real victimization occurred because the victim's gender or their lifestyle makes them people who society doesn't care about, therefore they're not victims, right? Remember back to when we talked about techniques of neutralization. So, how do sexual predators dispose of bodies? Well, Beauregard looks at another study, and they looked at body disposal patterns of 85 sexual murderers. And they noted that offenders who were in a relationship at the time of their crime are more likely to move the victim's body. But when the victim was older and experienced a prior conflict with the offender, it's more likely to be left at the scene. Okay, so what do we do? So your book's going to tell you about a whole bunch of different agencies that address different things having to do with serial murder, right? But the National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime and VICAP are the first 2 that they talk about. So the NCAVC is a clearinghouse. It's got lots of resources for law enforcement, and it's for unusual, bizarre, vicious, repetitive, violent crimes. And that's 4 core programs. They have a group that does research and development, one that does training, one that does profiling and consultation, and then the VICAP program, which is Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, which actually doesn't exist anymore. But VICAP was part of the behavioral science unit. And it was basically some sophisticated software where if you were a police officer working a crime that was particularly vicious or unusual or repetitive, you could put in information about that crime into VICAP. And then VICAP would search through for similar crimes, similar patterns, and it would give you a list of the top 10 matches. And this is called template pattern matching. But VICAP was criticized. Oh, it's not catching any criminals. But part of the reason for that is that law enforcement really wasn't cooperating with it. It's only going to work if police are inputting that information. So if you're not inputting that information into VICAP, then there's nothing for VICAP to really compare it to. So VICAP's no longer exists. So what do we need to solve a crime? Okay. There's some factors that are going to play a role in how solvable a crime is. What is the quality of the interviews with eyewitnesses? Now, remember, we know that eyewitnesses are not good witnesses, right? So we need people to who really know how to interview correctly. What are the circumstances that lead to the initial stop of the murderer? What circumstances establish probable cause to search and seize physical evidence? The quality of the investigations at the crime scene, and then the quality of the scientific analysis of that physical evidence. Now, there's lots of jobs you can go into here that have something to do with like forensics, okay? So remember, forensics really just means other related to the courts, right? So here's a whole wide variety of jobs. This is a good set of jobs to look at because we have people from a wide variety of majors taking this class, right? So you don't have to do something that is sort of what you might think of as traditionally criminal justice. You can see there's a lot of stuff here that overlaps with education or human services or psychology or social work. And then, as I mentioned, your book talks about a variety of other agencies. So please make sure you kind of read up on these. Now, another interesting way that we do research to help us is body farms. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of these. The most famous one is in Tennessee. There's 5 operating in the US right now, and they're connected to university research centers. And so basically, when you die, you can donate your body to science. You could donate it to one of the body farms. And what they do is they observe bodies decomposing under controlled conditions. So, when you're watching a TV show and they're like, oh, it has this kind of bug and the bug is this far into the development stage, and how they can use that to figure out when the person died. This is how they know that stuff, from studying these bodies. Okay. And they also skeletonize those remains, and they're used in their research. We also know some police departments have cold case units or cold case review teams, right? They're going to work sometimes with the district attorney's office to go back to try to re-examine, put a fresh set of eyes on cases where something hasn't been solved yet. Sometimes, too, we're able to go back and apply new technology. So you guys might be familiar with the Golden State Killer case, where that guy operated for a long time. And initially, they thought they had two different offenders. Because initially he's committing a series of rapes, and then he progresses in a different part of California to murders. They were able to use familial DNA. So they were able to run his DNA through, it wasn't 23andMe or Ancestry.com. Those two are a lot tighter. But they were able to run it and upload it into another genealogy site, and then they found a distant relative, and then that allows them to work their way backwards to potentially identify the offender. And they did find him. He's in the 70s, and part of why he was able to get away with it for so long is he's a former police officer. So sometimes we're going back and we're looking at new technology. Are there things available now that weren't available when this case happened? Now, we also want to be careful to obviously avoid investigative failures. And investigations can fail for many reasons, but sometimes it's our cognitive bias. We have tunnel vision. We're focused on, we think this is the path. We think this is the type of offender. We have to be open to more than that. We want to look out for organizational traps. Is everybody who's on the task force, are you guys engaging in group think? Um, and we want to watch out for probability errors. The thing that is most statistically likely does not necessarily mean it's true. Now, some obstacles we face here in learning about serial killers is that they're not only rare, but they're also not easily accessible. Like, if I want to study serial killers, I cannot just call up a bunch of prisons and be like, hey, you mind if I pop in and talk to so and so? Right? But the FBI has easy access to them. And certainly once they're incarcerated, they do. But that doesn't mean all these offenders want to talk to the police. It also doesn't mean that some of them do want to talk to, sorry, they don't necessarily want to talk to the police, but some of them might really want to talk to the police. And these are all things that can kind of get in the way of what we can learn. So when folks are interviewing serial killers, they want to make sure they maintain their objectivity, acknowledge their perspectives, and understand that asking the right questions is more important than getting quick answers. Now, there's problems with interviewing, obviously, right? So sometimes the interview is tainted by biases of the researcher. Sometimes the researcher gets a false positive, so they predict behavior, but they're wrong, or they get a false negative. They predict that behaviors will not occur, and they do. You want to make sure you're weighing the case in its entirety. You want to make sure you're not making false correlations or assuming just because two things are correlated, that means they're causal. You want to make sure that your prior knowledge that you have doesn't mean you're expecting certain responses. You don't want to be overly confident or overly focused. Now, we have to remember that children may often forget what we as adults say or do to them, but they never forget how we make them feel, right? What are we hearing from a lot of these serial killers is that there's massive rejection in their childhood. Now, we've all experienced rejection and we did not decide to go kill a bunch of people, right? But reducing violence in the home really appears to be the best path, not just for serial killers, but offenders in general. Now, every year we have about 15,000 murders in the US, but over a 10-year period, we have maybe 100, 150 serial killers. Um, or 150 deaths committed by serial killers. So maybe 1 of every 30, 1 of every 40 deaths in any year in the US are from serial killers. A lot of times these offenders end up with celebrity status. And many Americans are apprehensive about any punishment for a serial killer short of the death penalty. Now, remember that not all states are death penalty states. So, if you killed only people in Massachusetts, you'd not be eligible for the death penalty. And that a lot of killers are not going to go to trial. They're going to take a plea bargain to take the death penalty off the table. Regardless of whether or not you think the death penalty works, it is not a deterrent. It does not work. Most killers are not recidivists. Okay? Not serial killers. Most other killers kill once and that's it. Despite all this, you do not need to worry. Most serial killers are never going to see the light of day again once they've been incarcerated.